Okay, so I want to have a discussion here, and I want to talk about the first episode of the Watchmen TV series, Watchmen episode 1. I want to do a review on this because, normally I kind of stick to comics, but I think this is cool, right? Because the Watchmen is one of those series that is so unique in terms of how it functions, right? I mean, the Watchmen show the Watchmen comic has spawned like entire theses, right? Like people have written theses for philosophy classes and things like that. Entire courses have been taught about like the philosophy of the Watchmen by Alan Moore. And so to turn it into a TV series is a really good thing, and it can be kind of a dangerous game for super diehard Watchmen fans. But I think it's pretty solid. Like I think it's really awesome. The reality is that I didn't really know what to expect going into it. I did to a degree just because of the fact that I'd read enough to know the Watchmen TV series takes place after the original events, but I didn't read a whole lot into it. Right? I didn't read a lot of the articles because I didn't really want to have anything spoiled for me. I wanted to go ahead and just sort of go in blind for the most part and just kind of figure things out for myself. I like the way things are going. Like I like the way the show progresses. I mean, spoilers, a few spoilers here and there for those of you guys who haven't seen it yet. There's a few things that sort of caught me off guard, right? The idea that the police are using masks, that kind of threw me off, right? Because masks were outlawed by vigilantes, or outlawed for basically anybody to use, right? Like you couldn't use a mask and be a superhero. The notion that kind of has sort of been turned on its head, and police use them as a means to hide their identities from vigilantes or those who would try to take out police officers, the 7th Cavalry, different things like that, is sort of a cool concept. It's very real and very tangible, right? Like, I mean, imagine, for example, the American people were just like, we're tired of police brutality, like, we're gonna treat police the way they treat people, and then suddenly cops start covering their faces, things like that, so you don't really know who they are. It seems very real, like something that could actually happen in the real world in like the next 10 years or something like that. So that aspect I really enjoyed. The notion of the 7th Cavalry strikes me a little strange, right? I understand where they're coming from insofar as the perversion of a symbol that was originally designed to stand for one thing and is now standing for something else. I never really saw Rorschach as an individual who was like, let's take out cops or anything like that, some kind of extreme terrorist or something along those lines. I always saw Rorschach as a guy who was just sort of like anybody who is corrupt is going to be dealt with accordingly, right? Cop, political official, otherwise, like, a very Punisher-esque character, right? Insofar as like taking the law into his own hands and just kind of be like, sometimes the law is not enough, sometimes people need to be dealt with accordingly, and just kind of going from there. I never really saw him as an agent of like chaos, or an agent of a guy who would go around and say like, we're going to take out cops. Now, in reality, I don't think the 7th Cavalry's been fully fleshed out, but if I'm being honest, I think we've kind of seen pretty much all that we really need insofar as like what their motivations and what their ideologies are. But again, there's a lot more episodes to go, so there's probably a lot more fleshing out that's going to happen there. But I think it's sort of strange and a little interesting to see the Rorschach concept used in that way. I would see the Rorschach concept being used more for like the Joker film, for example. People who are just who don't really take the law into their own hands so much as they promote lawlessness, like vigilantes, and then just say, well, I guess vigilantes do take the law into their own hands, and then just saying like we're wearing a Rorschach mask because of that, and just kind of going forward from there. So I don't know, like individuals who promote civil unrest, I could see, using Rorschach masks. But yeah, no, it's interesting though, because when I look at it, there were a few things that sort of stood out to me, right? Like one, my first question going into the show is it going to take place after the events of the movie or after the events of the comic? That was really the biggest question that I had here. And of course, it takes place after the comic book. And looking at that, at first I wasn't really sure, but as I began to go through, I was like, okay, so there's no real references to like the explosions across the world that happened from Adrian Veidt, right? Like, him blowing up all these different places. Instead, like when they have that one guy in the pod and things like that, and they show that newspaper clip and so on, and it's like, do you believe that interdimensional invasions are a real possibility, that kind of thing? And it's like, okay, so they're making a reference to the interdimensional alien that was used, or a monster that was used at the end of the Watchmen comic that was used by Ozymandias, that attacked New York and killed a whole bunch of people. So okay, cool, like I can roll with that. The reference to Dr. Manhattan just being there, or at least kind of being on Mars or out doing his own thing or what have you, I think it's kind of cool. I think it's a pretty smart move to sort of leave him out of it. I know that in the preview at the end of the first episode, there was one scene where a guy looks like he has a blue finger and taps on a table or something like that. I imagine if Dr. Manhattan appears in the Watchmen show, I think it'll be more of a flashback than anything else. I don't think we'll actually see him doing anything in particular. Now, it may be that there's spoilers out there that say, here's exactly what's going to happen with Manhattan. I haven't really looked into the spoilers too much. I kind of want to save that as a surprise for myself. But yeah, no, it's cool. Here's a question that I have here, right? Because there's one point where you see a newspaper where you have that one guy who's played by Louis Gossett Jr., the guy who's the older version of the little kid that you saw at the very beginning, and there's a newspaper that he's holding that you only see like a portion of it, and it says like Adrian Veidt officially declared dead or something like that. At least that's what it looked like to me. And of course you end up finding out Jeremy Irons is basically Adrian Veidt, right? You know, Adrian Veidt is still very much alive. That intrigued me because as soon as I thought about that, I was like, so is this gonna like bookend into Doomsday Clock? Is that what this is gonna do? Like it's gonna explain the what happened between the events of the original Watchmen and the Doomsday Clock comic, or is it just kind of out there by itself and has nothing to do with what's going on with Doomsday Clock? I don't know the answer to that question. If it did have anything to tie into Doomsday Clock, it would do it loosely insofar as it wouldn't involve any of the characters from DC, and it would just involve, like Watchmen themselves. And it may end with Adrian Veidt being like, and now we're gonna go to a different universe and try to find Manhattan or something like that, but nonetheless, the show itself is good. Here's one of the big things that kind of struck me as strange. Whenever you go, at least in my experience anyway, whenever I see the first episode of a show, the first episode really seems to serve the purpose of not really being like an hour long or a half hour long, however long the episodes are. It's not really designed to be that long of like a preview, like, in this season of whatever this show is, here's an hour long preview of what's to come, but certainly hit on more than a few marks. And in terms of creating the tone of the show, in terms of what we're going to see as far as like how the characters function and what the overall tone in terms of violence and things like that's going to be, I think it did a great job. But looking at the previews for the second episode, there's a lot that we haven't seen yet. Now, I think that's good insofar as it leaves stuff to the imagination, and it leaves us to kind of wonder what direction the show's going to go in and how far down this rabbit hole we're really going to go. But at the same time, it's kind of like, okay, but like, the first episode feels so different from what the previews look like for the second episode and even the future episodes. Now again, that's the nature of the beast, right? I mean, it's designed to be one of these things where like as the show progresses, the show evolves and it grows and it becomes totally different from what it was. I mean, after all, if the entire series of Breaking Bad felt like episode 1, it would have burned out super fast. It would have burned out like that, right? People would have been like, okay, this is dumb, and they would have turned it off. So it makes sense that it would evolve and it would grow and it would change, so that kind of thing. So I don't really hold that as like a strike against the show or anything. Just caught me sort of interesting. Regina King is amazing. Like, she's awesome in that show. I love the way she plays her character. Don Johnson, I feel like should have lasted longer. I feel like getting rid of him at the end of the first episode kind of sucks because, and the reason why is I think they're using the death of his character as a means to sort of explain why it is that like Regina King is going to go on this kind of warpath. But I feel like she already had that explanation. Right? I mean, like, you literally get the story of her character where she's standing in front of all those kids and she's like, well, I was a cop, and before cops were able to hide their faces, people knew who we were and they tracked me down and they shot me and, so on and so forth. And so she already has a vendetta against those 7th Cavalry guys. I guess maybe this kind of adds on to it, but it feels kind of unnecessary. And I loved Don Johnson's character. I loved the way, his character about Judd. I loved him in terms of how he related, because initially I was like, well, maybe he's like a mole. Maybe he's part of the 7th Cavalry, but like on the inside. And he's like feeding him information and stuff like that. I guess kind of snuffing that out and nipping it in the bud really sort of takes care of that. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's possible that he's not even dead at all. I mean, he is. I mean, I don't know why he wouldn't be, but still, it's interesting. It's just kind of a strange choice, kind of a weird choice. But again, I realize at this point I'm kind of nitpicking, I'm kind of looking at small little things and nitpicking them. But in terms of my perspective and the overall tone of the show, I loved it. Like, I thought the Watchmen show was incredibly good. The character of Laurie. Okay, see, here's one of the big things. After the Watchmen comics were over and you finished it, you never really found out what happened to like Night Owl and to Laurie Jaspezic and those characters. And well, at least with Doomsday Clock picking up, you never found out what happened to them. And it wasn't until later on in Doomsday Clock that you end up realizing like they settled down and basically adopted, had a kid, that kind of a thing. Or at least they would have a kid anyway. From Dr. Manhattan's vision, that they would have adopted the daughter of Marionette, and they would have gone forward from there, but presumably their entire lives were wiped out, when the Earth ended basically in a nuclear holocaust. But that was basically it. In this, what you end up finding out, or at least from what we've seen, is that instead of it being Lori Jaspezek, she's called Lori Blake. And I like that idea, because what it means is that Lori has full on accepted the fact that like the comedians are dead, or at least that seems to be the case, which I dig. I actually sort of dig that. I think that's a pretty good nod to the old comics. And then in turn, she kind of goes forward accordingly. My question is she still in a relationship with Night Owl, right? Like is she still part of his life, and are they doing their own thing, or how all that went forward? Speaking of Night Owl, it was cool to see the ship. I dug that, to see his ship and see them shoot down that plane. That was pretty awesome to see those little remnants sort of gathered together. I don't really know how all that ties together, if Night Owl willingly handed it over, or if it was all co-opted, if it was all just taken over by the government, and it was like all your stuff, all your base now belong to us. I don't, what is it? All your base are belong to us. I don't know if that was the intention or anything, but it's in terms of the show, it obviously builds on the comics, but it feels different enough that there's enough interest and intrigue there that I'm like, okay, I wonder where this goes. I wonder what direction this is going to go in. I'm curious about that, but I don't know. I mean, it's one of these things where as the show progresses, either it could turn out to be super good, or it could just fall flat on its face. Based on what I've seen on the first episode, I think it's going to turn out to be exceedingly good. I think it's going to progress and become an amazing show. I don't recall if it's only limited to one season, or if they're going to do it for a few seasons. That I'm not 100% sure about. I feel like I want to say that it's only one season, like I read that somewhere, but I'm not going to take that as an absolute truth. But if you're on the fence about it, I would highly suggest checking it out, right? It's an awesome first episode getting into it. Again, I think Jeremy Irons, and I was actually talking to Mariah about this, I feel like Jeremy Irons would have been a great choice for Ozymandias in the first movie, right? Like I feel like he would have been a great choice. She made a really good point in saying that she thought he was too old, but I was like, I feel like he would have been a great Ozymandias. My question is, like, what's the whole idea about the plot and the watchmaker's son? That's what I want to know. I assume it's about John Osterman, about Dr. Manhattan, but I'm not 100% sure. Either way, like it's awesome. Like the show is super good. It's wildly intriguing. I'm definitely gonna be back for episode 2. And if episode 2 feels anything like episode 1 in terms of like the action and the sequences and all that kind of stuff, it's definitely gonna hold my attention. I loved it. I absolutely loved it, and I'll definitely be back for more. So yeah, with that being said, guys, let me know what you guys think about this review. Let me know what you think about reviewing episodes of The Watchmen. But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.